Imagine standing in the middle of Manhattan in 1870. The city smells of horse manure and coal smoke. The streets are loud, chaotic, and electric with a kind of ambition that has no precise name yet. The Civil War ended just 5 years ago, and the country is in the middle of one of the most extraordinary economic explosions in human history. New fortunes are being made so fast that the language barely has time to catch up. What if I told you that within a single generation, a handful of families in this very city would accumulate wealth that rivals the treasuries of small nations? That they would build private homes so large and so ornate that European monarchs would send their architects to take notes? That is not an exaggeration. That is, quite literally, what happened. Mark Twain himself, one of the sharpest observers of American life, coined a term for this era, the Gilded Age. The name was meant as satire, a reference to the thin gold veneer that concealed deeper social tensions, but the name stuck. And the era it describes, roughly 1870 to 1900, changed the United States forever. By 1890, the wealthiest 1% of Americans owned 1/4 of the nation's assets. By 1900, the richest 10% controlled perhaps 90% of the country's wealth. These weren't just statistics. They were the foundation upon which an entirely new American aristocracy built itself, in marble, limestone, and imported French stone. At the center of all of it was New York City, and at the center of New York City stood a single street, Fifth Avenue. But before we walk that street, we need to understand the man who started it all. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt, and he did not come from money. He was born in 1794 on Staten Island, the son of a farmer and boatman. He quit school at age 11 to work on the waterfront. At 16, with a $100 loan from his parents, he bought his first boat and began ferrying passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan. He repaid the loan within months. Think about that. A teenager with a borrowed boat. That boy would die in 1877 as one of the richest men who had ever lived. How? Through an almost inhuman combination of competitiveness and strategic ruthlessness. He became a dominant force in the steamship industry by engaging in fierce fare wars with rivals. In several documented cases, competitors found it cheaper to pay him to go away than to fight him. This was not a man who played by conventional rules. This was a man who rewrote them. By the time he was 45, Vanderbilt was a millionaire and operated more than 100 steamships running between New York and Boston, employing more workers than any other single business in the United States. During the California gold rush of the early 1850s, he launched a steamship service transporting prospectors from New York to San Francisco via Nicaragua, beating the established Panama route in speed and undercutting it in price. That line earned more than $1 million a year. Then came the Civil War, and with it, a pivot that would define the rest of his life. Nearly 70 years old, Vanderbilt shifted his entire focus to railroads. Most men of his generation were thinking about their graves. Cornelius Vanderbilt was thinking about Chicago. He acquired the Hudson River Railroad and the New York Central Railroad, consolidating them in 1869. By 1873, after adding the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railroad, he could offer the first unbroken rail service from New York City to Chicago, connecting the financial capital of the East Coast to the industrial heart of the continent. In 1871, he consolidated operations at a new terminal on West 42nd Street, Grand Central Depot, the original Grand Central Terminal. The traveler who walks through Grand Central today is moving through the physical monument of this man's ambition. When Vanderbilt died on January 4, 1877, at age 82, his fortune was estimated at nearly $100 million, worth over $230 billion in today's currency. He willed $95 million to his son, William, and only $500,000 to each of his 8 daughters. It was a reflection of the inheritance laws and gender assumptions of the era, and it concentrated the Vanderbilt fortune into a single pair of hands. William Henry proved worthy of that inheritance. A methodical businessman, very different from his father's combative style, he was the only Vanderbilt heir who actually increased the family fortune. He expanded the New York Central Railroad, doubled the family's wealth, and built the first grand Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue at number 640. With that building, the dynasty entered its second, more visible phase. In 1882, William Henry bought an entire block between 51st and 52nd Streets, constructing what became known as the Triple Palaces, three nearly identical brownstone mansions for himself and members of his immediate family. Henry Clay Frick, already a wealthy industrialist, reportedly passed by in his carriage and said, "That is all I shall ever want." When one of the richest men in America looks at your house and feels awe, you have built something remarkable. But remarkable was a moving target in this family. William Henry's son, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, went further. His mansion at the corner of 57th Street and 5th Avenue was expanded over a decade into a structure spanning an entire city block. 137 rooms across 6 floors, including 37 bedrooms, a grand dining room that doubled as an art gallery, and a Louis XIV-inspired ballroom. It was, for a time, the largest private residence ever built in Manhattan. And still, the dynasty was not finished. George Washington Vanderbilt II, the youngest son of William Henry, had no interest in railroads or stock battles. He was interested in art, literature, landscape, and the idea of building something that would outlast every fortune ever made in America. In 1889, he broke ground near Asheville, North Carolina, on an estate he called Biltmore. Construction required approximately 1,000 workers and 60 stonemasons over 6 years. Vanderbilt made repeated trips to Europe during that period, purchasing thousands of furnishings, tapestries, carpets, linens, and decorative objects dating from the 15th century onward. The finished house, designed by architect Richard Morris Hunt in the French Renaissance style, spans 175,000 square feet, 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces. George Vanderbilt opened it to family and friends on Christmas Eve, 1895. It cost approximately $5 million to build, equivalent to around $194 million today. It remains to this day the largest privately owned home in the United States. That is the arc of the Vanderbilt story, from a borrowed $100 and a single rowboat to the most grandiose private residence ever constructed on American soil. 3 generations, less than a century, they were the first. They built the template. And in the chapters ahead, we will meet the families who followed, and in some cases surpassed them. If the Vanderbilts built the infrastructure of America, the Astors owned its most valuable real estate. And when we say owned, we mean it almost literally. No family in the history of the United States ever held as concentrated a grip on a single major city as the Astors held on New York. But to understand how that happened, we have to start at the very beginning. Not in a mansion on Fifth Avenue, in a butcher shop in Germany. Johann Jakob Astor was born in 1763 in the small town of Walldorf near Heidelberg, in what is now the German state of Baden-Württemberg. His father was a butcher. The family had nothing remarkable to speak of. No land, no title, no inheritance. The boy left Germany as a teenager, first working in London for his brother manufacturing musical instruments, then crossing the Atlantic in 1784, just after the end of the American Revolutionary War, with little more than ambition and a handful of flutes he planned to sell. He arrived in a young republic that had not yet figured out what it would become. John Jacob Astor would help decide. On the ship to America, Astor reportedly spoke with a fellow passenger involved in the fur trade. By the time the boat docked, he had resolved to enter that business. He started by purchasing animal hides from Native Americans near the New York waterfront and selling them to buyers in Europe, a trade with markups that could reach 600 or 700% on a single transaction. He was meticulous, relentless, and entirely without sentiment when it came to profit. By 1800, he had amassed approximately $250,000 and become one of the leading figures in the American fur trade. In 1808, he formalized his dominance by founding the American Fur Company, the first business monopoly in United States history, capitalized entirely with his own money. Within roughly 15 years, it had driven out or absorbed virtually every competitor, controlling the trade across the Missouri River Territory and the Great Lakes region. But Astor, unlike many men of his era, was always looking at the next thing. And in the early 19th century, the next thing was land. Here is the decision that made the Astor dynasty permanent. While other men spent their fortunes, John Jacob Astor bought Manhattan. He had begun acquiring real estate in the city as early as the 1790s. But it was in the 1830s, as his fur trade profits peaked and his dominance of that industry became complete, that he made the pivotal move. He liquidated nearly all his commercial interests and reinvested everything into Manhattan real estate. He bought parcels of land well beyond the existing city limits, in areas that most New Yorkers considered remote and undeveloped. He was betting that the city would grow northward. He was right. The island of Manhattan had approximately 33,000 inhabitants in 1790. By 1850, it had over 500,000. Every immigrant who arrived, every worker who came to build the railroads and the factories, every merchant who needed a storefront, they all needed somewhere to live. And an enormous portion of that somewhere belonged to John Jacob Astor. His genius, documented by historians, was not merely that he bought land, it was that he almost never sold it. Instead, he leased parcels to developers and collected rents indefinitely, a strategy that meant the land kept appreciating while the income stream never stopped. When Astor died in 1848, his estate was estimated at between $20 and $30 million, roughly equivalent to between $750 million and $1 billion today. He was the wealthiest person in the United States at the time of his death, holding approximately 1% of the entire nation's GDP in his personal fortune. A contemporary senator remarked that 1 in every $100 in America ended up in Astor's hands. He was also the first self-made multimillionaire in the country's history. His son, William Backhouse Astor, inherited the empire and expanded it further, building more than 700 stores and dwellings across New York City and more than doubling the family fortune to nearly $50 million. William's son, John Jacob Astor III, pushed the estate to between $75 and $100 million. 3 generations, each one richer than the last, all from leasing the ground beneath other people's feet. By the time of the Gilded Age, the Astor family did not merely own large portions of Manhattan. They also, through one remarkable woman, controlled something harder to quantify and arguably more powerful, the social order of New York City itself. Her name was Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor. She was known simply as Mrs. Astor, and for nearly 4 decades, no title in America carried more weight. Caroline was born in 1830 into the Schermerhorn family, descendants of the original Dutch settlers of New York. Her pedigree, in other words, predated the Republic itself. When she married William Backhouse Astor Jr. in 1853, she brought ancient lineage to a family that already had almost incomprehensible wealth. The combination made her formidable. She and her husband built a brownstone townhouse at 350 Fifth Avenue, a property that today is the site of the Empire State Building. It was from this address, and later from a grander mansion uptown, that she organized what may be the most exclusive social system in American history. Working alongside a social advisor named Ward McAllister, a Georgian who had made it his life's work to study European court etiquette, Mrs. Astor established what became known as the 400. McAllister declared in an 1888 interview with the New York Tribune that there were only 400 people in New York who truly mattered in fashionable society. The number was linked, in popular perception, to the capacity of Mrs. Astor's own ballroom. Whether or not the ballroom actually held exactly 400 people, the implication was clear. If you were not on the list, you did not belong. The official list was published in the New York Times in February 1892. It consisted largely of bankers, lawyers, real estate owners, and railroad men, the knobs of old money, joined reluctantly by select representatives of newer industrial fortunes. To be excluded was, in the words of one contemporary observer, social doom. No amount of wealth could substitute for Mrs. Astor's approval. She received guests standing in front of a large portrait of herself painted in Paris, draped in diamonds and wearing a tiara. She attended her annual January ball adorned in jewels worth millions of dollars by modern valuations. She ruled without title as the uncontested queen of New York society for 4 decades. When she died in 1908, it reportedly took 3 prominent women, Mamie Fish, Teresa Ulrichs, and Alva Belmont, to collectively fill the role she had held alone. The Astor story has one final, unforgettable chapter, one that would leave its mark not just on the family, but on world history. John Jacob Astor IV, Caroline's only son, was one of the wealthiest men in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. an inventor, a novelist, and a builder of grand hotels, including the St. Regis and the Astoria, he was, in the estimation of the era, everything a Gilded Age heir should be. His fortune was estimated at roughly $100 million, equivalent to several billion today. In April 1912, he boarded the RMS Titanic with his young second wife, Madeleine. He was 47 years old. When the ship struck the iceberg and began to sink, he placed his pregnant wife into a lifeboat. He was the wealthiest passenger aboard. He did not survive. The dynasty that began with a butcher's son selling beaver pelts on the New York waterfront ended its great American chapter in the North Atlantic in the early hours of April 15, 1912. We've met the man who controlled the arteries of transportation and the family that owned the ground beneath New York City's feet. Now we turn to a fortune so vast, so systematically constructed, that it has never quite been matched in American history. Not by the Vanderbilts, not by the Astors, and arguably not by anyone who came after. John D. Rockefeller was, by most serious historical measures, the wealthiest private individual in the history of the modern world. His personal fortune, estimated at approximately $900 million in 1913, represented close to 3% of the entire United States GDP at that time. To put that in perspective, 3% of the current American GDP would be roughly $1 trillion today. And he started as a bookkeeper, earning 50 cents a day. John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in the small town of Richford in upstate New York. His family lived in modest circumstances. His father was a traveling salesman with a reputation for sharp dealing. His mother was a devout Baptist who instilled in her children a strict religious discipline that John would carry for the rest of his life. The family moved frequently during his childhood, eventually settling near Cleveland, Ohio. At 16, Rockefeller found work as a clerk at a Cleveland commission firm dealing in grain, coal, and other commodities. He was meticulous, careful, and obsessively organized with money. Even as a young man, he kept a personal account book recording every cent he earned and spent, a habit he maintained for decades. He considered the day he started his first job, September 26, 1855, so significant that he celebrated it privately as Job Day for the rest of his life. By 1859, the first American oil well had been drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Rockefeller saw what it meant. 4 years later, at age 24, he and a partner invested in an oil refinery in Cleveland. 2 years after that, he bought out his partners and took control of what had become the largest refinery in the city. In 1870, he formalized his ambitions. Together with his brother William Henry Flagler and several other partners, he incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio with a starting capital of $1 million. What followed over the next decade is one of the most studied and debated episodes in American business history. Rockefeller's core insight was simple but devastating to competitors. The oil industry was chaotic. Prices swung wildly. Refiners undercut each other into bankruptcy. Fortunes were made and destroyed within months. Rockefeller believed, with almost religious conviction, that order was better than chaos, and that he was the man to impose it. His method was systematic consolidation. Standard Oil negotiated secret rebate agreements with the major railroads, the New York Central, the Erie, and the Pennsylvania, obtaining drastically lower freight rates than any competitor could access. This allowed Standard to undercut rivals on price, drive them to the edge of bankruptcy, and then purchase them at distressed valuations. By 1872, Standard had purchased nearly all the refining firms in Cleveland, plus 2 major refineries in metropolitan New York. The process continued without pause. By the early 1880s, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of all oil refining and pipelines in the United States. It had pushed the price of refined kerosene from 58 cents a gallon down to 8 cents, making light affordable for ordinary American households for the first time. Standard Oil's blue barrels became one of the most recognizable symbols in the country. The scale of what Rockefeller had built had no precedent. Standard Oil was not merely the dominant company in its industry. It was, in the estimation of contemporary critics and later historians, a state within the state, setting prices, controlling transportation, and determining the economic fate of entire regions. Journalists and politicians took notice. Ida Tarbell, whose father had been one of the independent oil producers Rockefeller had absorbed, spent years researching the company's practices. Her 1904 book, published initially as a series of essays in McClure's magazine, exposed in precise detail the rebate schemes, the coercive buyouts, and the intelligence network standard used to monitor competitors. It became one of the most consequential works of investigative journalism in American history. Public outrage followed. In 1911, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil had violated federal antitrust law and ordered its dissolution into 34 separate companies. Among the entities that emerged from that breakup were the predecessors of what are today ExxonMobil and Chevron. The dissolution, paradoxically, made Rockefeller even richer. As a major shareholder in each of the successor companies, he benefited from the rise in their individual stock prices that followed the breakup. It was at this point, 1913, that his personal wealth peaked at approximately $900 million. What set the Rockefellers apart from the Vanderbilts and Astors was not just the scale of the fortune, it was the deliberate, almost calculated restraint with which they displayed it. While Cornelius Vanderbilt II was building a 137-room palace on Fifth Avenue, John D. Rockefeller was living in a devoutly Baptist household, attending church every Sunday, abstaining from alcohol and tobacco, and teaching Sunday school into his middle age. He and his wife Laura raised their children in an atmosphere of structured religious discipline, family prayer, and financial accountability. The children were required to keep their own account books from early childhood. When the family eventually built an estate, they chose the rolling hills of Westchester County, 30 miles north of Manhattan, rather than the theatrical visibility of Fifth Avenue. The estate, named Kikwit, from the Dutch word for lookout, sits atop the highest point in Pocantico Hills, commanding sweeping views of the Hudson River. The 40-room house, completed in 1913, is elegant and restrained rather than ostentatious, described by historians as understated elegance at extraordinary scale. Rockefeller himself reportedly stated repeatedly that all he wanted was a simple house in the country to share with his family. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had grander architectural ambitions, but even those were tempered by the family's insistence on dignified proportion over theatrical excess. This restraint was not poverty of imagination. It was a deliberate philosophical choice, rooted in a Baptist faith that genuinely distrusted ostentation. The same ethos shaped Rockefeller's approach to wealth's final purpose. From the time he began earning money as a teenager, he donated a portion of every paycheck to his church. As the fortune grew, the giving grew proportionally. He funded the founding of the University of Chicago in 1889. He established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, today Rockefeller University, in 1901. Through the Rockefeller Foundation, created in 1913, he donated more than $500 million to educational, scientific, and public health causes during his lifetime. His son donated a comparable sum. 2 generations of the family, by documented records, gave away over $1 billion between 1860 and 1960. John D. Rockefeller died on May 23, 1937, at age 97, at his winter home in Ormond Beach, Florida. He had spent the last 4 decades of his life in retirement, playing golf, studying plants, and systematically giving away the fortune that Standard Oil had built. The man who once said, "Competition is a sin," ended his life as one of the greatest philanthropists in human history. We have traced the Vanderbilts across the rails, the Astors across the real estate ledgers, and the Rockefellers across the oil fields. Now we arrive at the 2 men who, in different ways, brought the entire Gilded Age to its logical conclusion, and then dismantled it. One was the most powerful private banker in American history. The other was the richest immigrant who ever stepped off a boat in New York Harbor. Their fates would intersect in 1901 in a transaction so large it had no precedent, a single deal that gave birth to the first billion-dollar corporation in the history of the world. But to understand that moment, we have to start at the beginning of each story. John Pierpont Morgan was born on April 17, 1837, in Hartford, Connecticut, into a family that was already wealthy. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a prominent international banker with a firm in London that financed American enterprise for European investors. His grandfather had co-founded Aetna Insurance. Morgan did not build his fortune from nothing. He inherited a platform, and then, through a combination of extraordinary financial intelligence and an almost terrifying force of personality, turned that platform into something the world had never seen before. He was educated in Switzerland and at the University of Göttingen in Germany, became fluent in French and German, and entered banking at 24 by opening his own foreign exchange office in New York. By 1871, he had formed a partnership with Philadelphia banker Anthony Drexel, creating Drexel, Morgan & Company, which became the primary American agent for his father's European firm. In 1895, after Drexel's death, the firm was reorganized as J.P. Morgan & Company, a direct predecessor of what is today J.P. Morgan Chase. What made Morgan different from his Gilded Age contemporaries was not the sector he chose, banking, but the scope of what he did within it. While Vanderbilt built railroads and Rockefeller refined oil, Morgan financed and organized virtually everyone else. Over the course of his career, he and his partners held controlling interests in 21 railroad companies, plus major stakes in General Electric, International Harvester, Western Union, the Pullman Car Company, and dozens of other enterprises. Biographer Ron Chernow described him plainly as America's greatest banker. He was not just participating in the Gilded Age economy, he was, in many ways, structuring it. The power Morgan wielded became most visible not during periods of prosperity, but during crisis, because in a country that had no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no government mechanism to inject liquidity into failing markets, J.P. Morgan was repeatedly the institution of last resort. The first demonstration came in 1895, during the aftermath of the Panic of 1893. The Federal gold reserves had been depleted so severely that the U.S. Treasury was on the verge of insolvency. Morgan traveled to Washington and presented President Grover Cleveland with a plan. Using an obscure Civil War statute, Morgan and the Rothschilds would sell 3.5 million ounces of gold directly to the U.S. Treasury in exchange for a 30-year bond issue. The plan worked, the reserves stabilized, the dollar was saved. A private banker had effectively rescued the creditworthiness of the United States government. 12 years later, in October 1907, the scenario repeated, but on a larger and more chaotic scale. A failed attempt to corner the copper market triggered a cascade of bank runs across New York City. Major trust companies began to collapse. The stock market fell into freefall. There was still no Federal Reserve, no government mechanism capable of stopping the contagion. Morgan, then 70 years old and semi-retired, called the leading bankers and trust company presidents to his private library on East 36th Street. What happened over the following days has been documented by historians as one of the most extraordinary episodes in American financial history. Morgan locked the bankers inside his library and refused to let them leave until they reached an agreement. According to documented accounts of the crisis, on the critical Saturday night, roughly 40 to 50 bankers gathered in Morgan's library, while negotiations continued into the small hours of the morning. Morgan himself sat in an armchair playing solitaire while the men argued. He did not emerge to speak until a resolution was reached. At one point, he reportedly locked the library doors and placed the key in his pocket. By morning, the plan was in place. The panic was halted. That library, a private building Morgan had commissioned in 1902 from the architectural firm McKim, Mead & White, costing $1.2 million, was where the American financial system was saved on at least 2 occasions. It contained 3 Gutenberg Bibles, original manuscripts by Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert, illuminated medieval manuscripts, Byzantine ivories, and one of the most extraordinary private collections of rare books and art ever assembled. Morgan described himself as a collector of collections. He is documented to have said, "No price is too high for an object of unquestioned beauty and known authenticity." Today, that building and its contents are open to the public as the Morgan Library and Museum in Manhattan. The Panic of 1907, however, also exposed the danger of a system in which the stability of the entire American economy rested on the decision of one private individual. The episode led directly to congressional investigations and ultimately to the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, the year Morgan himself died. Now we turn to the man whose company J.P. Morgan purchased in 1901 to create the largest corporation on earth, and whose life story is, in many ways, the most improbable of the entire Gilded Age. Andrew Carnegie was born on November 25, 1835, in Dunfermline, Scotland, in a single-room weaver's cottage. His father was a handloom weaver whose trade had been destroyed by the industrialization of the textile industry. When Andrew was 12 years old, the family emigrated to the United States with essentially nothing, settling near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Andrew took his first job in a cotton mill at 13, earning $1.20 per week. Let that settle for a moment. A 12-year-old immigrant from Scotland earning $1.20 a week in a Pennsylvania cotton mill, who would become, within 50 years, the richest man in the world. He rose quickly. His intelligence and reliability earned him a promotion to bookkeeper, then to telegraph messenger, then to telegrapher. By his early 20s, railroad executive Thomas Scott had noticed the young man's abilities and hired him as a personal secretary and telegrapher. This mentorship gave Carnegie his first exposure to how large enterprises were financed and managed. He began investing in oil companies, in iron, in railroad sleeping cars, and by his early 30s had accumulated a small but growing fortune. He saw the future clearly. America was building. Railroads needed rails, cities needed buildings, the Navy needed ships. Everything required steel. In the early 1870s, Carnegie entered the steel business, using the new Bessemer process to convert iron into steel at unprecedented scale and speed. He built his primary plant near Pittsburgh in 1875, and over the following 2 decades created an empire through a strategy historians describe as vertical integration. He owned not just the furnaces, but the iron mines, the coal fields, the railroad connections, and the shipping lines that fed them. By controlling every stage of production, he could drive costs lower than any competitor could match. His motto, documented in his own writings, was, "Watch costs, and the profits take care of themselves." In 1892, that empire was consolidated into the Carnegie Steel Company. That same year, one of the darkest episodes in American labor history unfolded at his Homestead, Pennsylvania plant. Workers protesting wage cuts were locked out of the facility by Carnegie's general manager, Henry Clay Frick. When the workers refused to leave, Frick hired approximately 300 armed Pinkerton agents to force them out. In the battle that followed, at least 10 men were killed. The state militia was called in. The Union was crushed. Carnegie was on vacation in Scotland during the strike. He had authorized Frick to handle it. The contradiction between his public image as a champion of working people and the violent reality of Homestead marked his reputation permanently. In late 1900, a dinner was held in New York in honor of Charles Schwab, the president of Carnegie Steel. J.P. Morgan attended and sat next to Schwab. Schwab spoke that evening about the vast potential of an organized, unified American steel industry. Morgan listened. Shortly afterward, he approached Carnegie about a purchase. Carnegie wrote his asking price on a slip of paper and had a manager deliver it to Morgan. The number was $480 million. Morgan accepted without hesitation. When the two men finalized the transaction, Morgan said to Carnegie, "Congratulations, Mr. Carnegie. You are now the richest man in the world." Carnegie personally received approximately $250 million from the sale, equivalent to roughly $4.5 billion today. Morgan then merged Carnegie Steel with 9 other steel companies to create the United States Steel Corporation, capitalized at $1.4 billion, making it the first corporation in history to surpass $1 billion in value. For context, the entire U.S. federal government spent only $517 million that year. Carnegie spent the remaining 18 years of his life giving it all away. He funded the construction of more than 2,500 public libraries across the United States and the English-speaking world. He built Carnegie Hall in New York City. He established Carnegie Mellon University. He founded the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Carnegie Institution for Science, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. He gave away approximately $350 million, nearly 90% of his entire fortune. His 1889 essay, known as The Gospel of Wealth, laid out his philosophy with a sentence that became one of the most quoted in American philanthropy. "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." Andrew Carnegie died on August 11, 1919, having kept his word almost entirely. He was buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in New York. And so, the Gilded Age ends where it began, in New York. 5 families, 5 different strategies. 5 different visions of what wealth meant and what it was for. The Vanderbilts built the transportation networks that connected the nation. The Astors owned the land beneath the city's feet and then its social hierarchy. The Rockefellers controlled the energy that lit American homes and powered its economy. The Morgans financed the machinery of capitalism itself, twice preventing the entire system from collapsing. And Carnegie, the Scottish weaver's son who arrived in America with nothing, built the steel that held it all together and then gave back nearly everything he had earned. Each left their mark on a city, a nation, and an era that still bears the weight of what they built. The mansions are mostly gone now. The companies have merged and split and merged again. But the infrastructure of modern America, its railroads, its financial system, its public libraries, its concert halls, its universities, carries their fingerprints still. The Gilded Age lasted 30 years. Its consequences have lasted more than a century.